Field spells are some of the most flavor-filled cards in the game, allowing you to literally level the playing field and give yourself a home turf advantage that will change depending on the world or location that you've terraformed into the terrain. But some fields are better than others, and while certain field spells are more than worth the travel, others are going to make you wish you'd stayed at home, something we figured out almost 5 years ago. But there are still some horrible field spells out there, some of which are even worse than the last time we made a video like this. And shining dimly at number 10, we have Array of Revealing Light, which, like Swords Revealing Light, can prevent monsters from attacking. But the way Array does it is so much worse. You see, while Swords prevents any monster your opponent controls from attacking at all for 3 turns while it's face up on the field, Array makes you declare a monster type, and while it's on the field, any monster that type you declared gains Summoning Sickness, preventing them from attacking. Now in the modern era, while attack prevention effects aren't as common as they would have been 20 years ago, they can still be quite effective when paired with the right strategies. Runic, for example, is predicated on its ability to draw cards every single turn with the effect of Runic Fountain to outgrind an opponent. And in such a strategy, surviving for an extra turn or two can be game-winningly strong by giving you a chance to draw even more cards. Which is why cards like Messenger of Peace and even Synchro Zone have seen contemporary competitive play. But even if you were a deck that could take advantage of these kinds of effects, you'd never run Array of Revealing Light. The most glaring downside of Array is that it's only effective against a single type of monster at a time. That means that for Array to have any kind of impact on a duel, you have to be aware of the type of monster your opponent is going to be playing before they actually summon them, or get extremely lucky with a guess. All that while hoping the strategy they're playing doesn't have a way to access any other monster types to do damage with. But another major aspect of the card that makes it so terrible is, at best, it's only stopping an attack for a single turn, and at worst, it's literally doing nothing, even if you call the correct type. And that's because of the specific way that Array prevents attacks, as it only stuns monsters of the declared type during the turn that they're summoned, and not on any other turn. So if you activate Array while going second and your opponent has already built up their board, they're just going to attack with the monsters they already have out and OTK you in the process. So, to recap, in order for Array to do anything, your opponent has to be playing a strategy with only a single type of monster in it. You have to be aware of that type, and you have to go first while having a way to access Array, and even if that all goes right, will only prevent you from being attacked for a single turn. This is a ton of conditions that you need for the card to be genuinely functional. While a card like Threatening Roar that does virtually the same thing as Array can be used going second, stops monsters of all types from attacking, and only needs you to set it for a turn so that it can function. If Array had been worded slightly differently, or could stop more than one type, then there's a world where it could have been an okay card to prevent attacks at some point in time. But as it stands right now, it's even outclassed by its older brother in Swords of Revealing Light, a card that's not only easier to use, but gives you a better payoff by stopping all of your opponent's attacks for multiple turns. And because Swords was released slightly before Array, the card was power crept before it was even released. Clearing a path to number 9 is Clear World, a card wielded by the penultimate villain of GX, Yusuke Fujiwara, to create a world without individuality. And Clear World does an interesting job of representing that, as it punishes both players for the deck's uniqueness by giving each player different downsides depending on the attributes they control. If you control a light, dark, and/or wind monster, you get an immediate drawback. With light, you have to play with your hand revealed at all times. With dark, you can't attack if you control 2 more monsters. And if you have wind on your side of the field, you have to pay 500 light points to activate any spell cards. Meanwhile, if you have fire, water, or earth, you get a delay drawback that takes place in a different phase. If you have a fire monster, then in your end phase you take 1000 damage, while if you control a water monster, to discard a card during the end phase. With an earth monster though, you have to destroy a face-up defense position monster you control during the standby phase. However, if you're the controller of Clear World, you'll have one more thing to worry about, as in order to keep it on the field, you have to pay 500 light points during each end phase or destroy the card. In theory, these drawbacks make both players think twice about the monsters they commit to the field, and you can punish an opponent by floodgating them under different detriments based on what they've summoned. But in practice, most of Clear World's effects don't really do anything. The downsides of having fire, water, or earth monsters don't really do anything to immediately impact the game state, which means that your opponent is essentially unhindered when using these attributes, allowing them to easily OTK you before any of these drawbacks can apply, or build up a board that puts them at such a disadvantage that discarding a blank card or taking 1000 burn damage isn't really going to hurt their chances of winning. And while the earth effect can technically help you going second to force an opponent to pop their own monster, you have to wait until their standby phase, making it an incredibly slow piece of removal that not only hopes that they have the right attribute, but that there's so many monsters in defense mode. Meanwhile, light, dark, and wind all have some kind of instant impact, but even in comparison to the effects that a fire, water, or earth monster would produce, these effects do little to nothing to actually change the game in your favor. Forcing your opponent to pay 500 life points for every spell they activate if they control wind can technically help do some damage, but it doesn't actually disincentivize them from using spells since they're going to get enough out of them to justify the 500 life point cost, especially since, even if they start at only 4,000 life points, they can activate 7 spells before they have to start worrying about Clear World's burn. And while getting free hand information from an opponent's light monster is useful, since you get knowledge on your opponent's available resources and potential plays, it doesn't do anything to stop those plays. And by the time you have the opportunity to take advantage of this effect, you're either going second into an opponent's board that's already been built up, or it's your opponent's turn, long after you've been able to customize your board to their hand. The only really relevant aspect of Clear World is its Dark effect, which can flagate an opponent from being able to declare an attack. And this effect is actually useful, as it can stop your opponent from just ending the game outright. But if you really need to stop an opponent from attacking, there are plenty of other better cards that you can play with much easier conditions compared to Clear World. In fact, no matter what effect of Clear World you specifically want to use, there's no guarantee that you'll actually be able to use it, as what the card does is based on what your opponent is playing. So even if you found a way to take advantage of one of Clear World's effects, you have to hope that your opponent is playing the right deck for it. Or you're playing the unsearchable card RGB Rainbowlution, which allows you to change one of your opponent's monsters to be all attributes. But the worst aspect of Clear World by far is that all of its potential downsides are reciprocal. So unless you jump to the hoops to summon out a Clear Vice Dragon, you're going to be giving yourself downsides as well. In fact, you have to deal with more drawbacks than your opponent does, since even if you don't commit anything to the field or have Clear Vice Dragon active, you're always going to pay 500 life points near each of your end phases if you want Clear World to remain on the field. Essentially putting you on a timer until your life points get close to 0 and you're forced to let Clear World go, all while making it easier for your opponent to hit for lethal. It's a shame that Clear World is as bad as it is, because its effect is conceptually kind of interesting. But not only is the card outdated and weak against an opponent, it being on field can actively hurt your chances of winning by paying 500 life points during each turn to floodgate yourself. And at number 8, we have Canyon, some not so grand support for rock types that serves as a monument to setting high defense monsters and passing, a memorial of an older time. Because all Canyon does is make it so that if a rock type monster is attacked and the attacking player would take damage from that attack, the damage they take is doubled what it would usually be. So if your opponent attacked into your giant soldier of stone with a 0 attack monster, they would take 4,000 damage. Now, when discussing the original 10 worst field spells in the game, we talked about how Canyon was pretty much just a better card than Acidic Downpour for supporting defense position strategies, since with Canyon up, you can do a lot more damage to your opponent if they misjudge your defenses, especially if you happen to have a stone statue of the Aztecs or exiled on your side of the field. But the thing about this effect is that it's extremely unlikely that a scenario like this would ever happen. Even if you set an unknown monster in the field and then activate Canyon, you immediately give away what you're up to, which means that if they're worried about taking a bunch of damage on their attack, they can either just use a piece of removal on Canyon or your monster to get rid of them from the field, or just not risk attacking it at all. But even if your opponent somehow makes the mistake of attacking into your rock monster, there's a chance they're not going to get punished at all, since the damage Canyon forces your opponent takes is based on the damage they would have received. And if they happen to beat over your pet rock using a monster with higher stats, Canyon might as well have the same effect as Toon World, since they'd be taking 0 damage. However, even if you somehow manage to get some damage out of Canyon, it's probably not going to be much, since they're going to be attacking with their highest attack monsters, which means if they do take damage from your defensive wall, it isn't going to result in winning a game on the spot. So while forcing an opponent to attack into your Exod with 0 attack monsters is a really funny way of winning the duel, it's definitely not optimal, or even likely you're going to be able to set this up without a ton of investment and a lot of luck. And at number 7, we have Shien's Castle of the Mist, a field spell that can make it harder for your opponent to beat over your 6 samurai monsters. The way Mist does this is by reducing the attack of your opponent's monsters that attacks a 6 samurai monster by 500, but only during damage calculation. Now, there are actually a ton of pretty terrible field spells in the game that modify stats of monsters in the field in one way or another. And we even featured quite a few of them in the original top 10, because while attack and defense still play an integral role in the modern era, it's usually not a good idea to spend a card solely for mediocre increases of stats, which is why old field spells like Sojin or Yami likely aren't going to be at the top tiers of competitive play anytime soon. But even though their stat increases are pretty small, these cards have dual utility in what they do, as they make your monsters harder to beat over, while also making it easier for you to beat over your opponent's monsters and potentially even OTK. But Shien's Castle's utility is singular, as it doesn't actually do anything to increase the stats of your 6 samurai monsters, so you can't use it as an offensive threat in the same way you could a Mountain or a Luminous Spark, making misuse limited to just hoping that your opponent hasn't read the card as they crash into your 6 samurai monsters, if you want to get any real value out of it, because in any other situation, it's essentially just going to be a blank card of the field against a smart opponent. This makes it very similar to Canyon in that you can only really use both cards in a defensive manner, But what puts Canyon above Castle of the Mist is that Canyon is unique in what it does as a field spell, and even has a couple of cards that it synergizes quite well with, while Castle of Mist is outclassed even within its own archetype. As if you needed a field spell to lower the stats of your opponent's monsters so your 6 samurais are harder to beat over, you can just play Temple of the Six, which grants Bushido counters every time a 6 samurai monster is normal or specialed, and reduces the attack of every single one of your opponent's monsters by 100 times the number of Bushido counters on Temple, which has the potential to reduce the attack of your opponent's monsters by way more than 500, especially given how capable 6 samurais are at spamming the field. Shien's castle is coincidentally the second castle that's been featured as part of the worst field spells of all time, and while it's definitely a better card than Watt Castle, it's not by much, since they're both solely defensive cards that you're just not going to get any real value out of. And starting at number 6, we have Dueltaining, a field spell that's meant to make you and your opponent to duel in an explosive and exciting manner, but ultimately forces you to jump the shark. While Dueltaining is active, it gives both players a chance to draw 2 cards each time to perform one of 5 actions to dazzle the crowd. But your audience will be bored if you do the same thing multiple times too quickly, so you can only draw 2 the first time you use each effect per turn. You can either excite the crowd by summoning 5 monsters at different levels at once, have them cheer for your champion monster that ends up battling 5 times in a single turn, impress them with a huge chain link by activating a card where effect is a chain link 5 or higher, amaze them by leaving it all to luck by rolling a 6-sided die or tossing a coin 5 times, or having them rooting for the underdog when your life points are damaged and brought below 500 or less, which, if you manage to do all these things, allows you to draw 10 cards during your turn. This sounds impressive at first, as only a few other effects in the game have the capability of drawing you this many cards in just a single turn. And if you can somehow achieve each of these conditions, you could overwhelm an opponent with sheer card advantage. But the major flaw in Dueltaining is that these conditions aren't always guaranteed to happen over the course of a duel, let alone on your first turn. And while that might make them more entertaining to see when they do happen, the card essentially forces you down the path of playing to achieve its draw artificially if you want to get any value out of it. But if you have the ability to go for one of Dueltaining's draws, you could instead be using your cards to build up your board, set up a resource loop, or go for lethal, things that are going to end up winning you the game naturally. But it's not just your play that Dueltaining can impact negatively. It can even hurt your deck building and the quality of the cards that you end up drawing. If you build your deck around getting off its draws as often as possible by filling it with different level monsters and dice roll or coin flip cards, then when you do end up achieving a Dueltaining draw, you're not likely to draw into a strong hand trap, play starters, and extenders. You're going to draw into multiple ways of pulling off one of Dueltaining's gimmicks. And while that can definitely help you draw a ton of cards, the cards you're drawing aren't going to necessarily help you win the duel. So for Dueltaining to work as a way to draw cards, you have to play it in a deck that is able to meet its conditions normally across the course of its regular combo. And there just aren't many viable strategies out there that do what Dueltaining wants them to do naturally. Now, thankfully, a couple of Dueltaining's conditions can be achieved by just about any strategy. But that includes your opponent too, as you're not the only one that can take advantage of Dueltaining draws. They get to use the card too. So even though they're probably not going to be rolling dice or attacking 5 times with a single monster, there's a very real chance of them forming a huge chain link when trying to make or break a board. So they'll end up drawing 2 whenever you just end up doing damage to them. When you put Dueltaining into your field zone, you're giving up a card to give both players a side quest if they want to draw 2. But you're at the disadvantage since you're the one that had to activate Dueltaining in the first place. So you're a card down compared to your opponent who'll get the chance to use Dueltaining for free. In general, it is pretty unfortunate that a card whose main goal is to encourage Yu-Gi-Oh to be a spectator sport is pretty terrible being hard to activate while giving your opponent a chance at free draws. But honestly, for as bad as it is, it doesn't need to be anything more than just a cool gimmick. Yu-Gi-Oh is already a fun game to watch at the competitive level for flashy and fun plays, and Dueltaining just gives anyone, including your opponent, a chance to embody the spirit of Yu-Gi-Oh Sakaki. And at number 5, we have Xyz Override, a card that, as per its name, is meant to support Xyz monsters by overriding their cost with a new one. However, this new cost is so much worse than what you'd usually do. You see, it's pretty common for Xyz monsters to have effects that require you to detach its materials to activate, but if you have Override on the field, instead of detaching materials, you or your opponent can choose to instead banish a card from their hand face down, but only once per turn. But you'd honestly never want to actually use this cost replacement, because needing to detach a material is very rarely a big deal, because detaching them doesn't make you lose any kind of tangible card advantage. And while there are certainly cards that you're always going to want to remain attached to an Xyz monster, you can just simply choose to not detach that card, such as in the case of Purely, where Noir is going to detach all of its other materials before detaching its level 1 Purely monster so it can remain a quick effect. so generally it's not worth spending cards to mitigate the cost of an Xyz monster, especially in the case of an Xyz Override, because you're not just discarding a card or even shuffling into the deck. It's getting banished face down, which stops you from using your banished card as any card or resource, as not only is it extremely hard to interact with face down banished cards, but you wouldn't even be able to trigger the effects of the card you choose to banish. And in that case, it's just not worth it to surrender the card advantage to save on materials that you can instead just detach from the materials of the Xyz monster you want to use. Especially because most Xyz are going to be summoned with materials they need to activate their effects anyway. In fact, while detached materials might be a mechanical cost, it can actually be quite a benefit when an Xyz monster detach, as it can set up your graveyard with potential resources and effects that otherwise would be stuck under an Xyz. However, despite how terrible Override's cost is, it does have one unique benefit. You can activate the effects of Xyz monsters with no materials. This is actually pretty interesting, as it means that even Xyz monsters that would normally just be a vanilla body can still be a threat for your opponent. However, you're still giving up card advantage to make this happen. In most cases, Override is just going to be making an Xyz monster's effect way less profitable if you use it as a cost replacement, especially when getting cards into your graveyard is usually just going to be a net benefit. And while there are niche applications where it could be useful, it's not going to be much most of the time. Graphic number 4 is Euler Circuit, a field spell that demands a pretty convoluted game plan in a deck that already struggles to win games. Euler's has 3 key effects. Its third effect isn't too relevant, but if it's in the graveyard, you can banish it to discard a TheDuelLogs card to add another copy of itself from your deck to your hand. But it's the first and second effect of Euler's that tries to be interesting. Its first effect makes it yet another field spell that can prevent your opponent from attacking, but only so long as you control 3 or more TheDuelLogs monsters. This is supposed to feed into its second effect, which allows you to give control of one of your TheDuelLogs monsters to your opponent during your standby phase. The idea behind Euler's Circuit is that by putting 3 TheDuelLogs on board, you can survive the turn since your opponent can't attack, and then on your following turn, you can give your opponent a low attack TheDuelLogs monster and link it off into a TheDuelLogs Acute Cerberus, which can increase its attack to an absurd degree, so long as TheDuelLogs base Garden is in the grave and it's pointed to a TheDuelLogs monster, and you happen to use TheDuelLogs to holes as material, or have Naggle's protection up, and you have an easy path to an OTK. But this win condition is overly complicated, and strangely seems to have no synergy with the actual deck because it's incredibly difficult to commit 3 face-up TheDuelLogs to the field. Now, the deck does have a few interesting ways of swarming the field with TheDuelLogs monsters. TheDuelLogs Dueltaining, for example, does a lot for the strategy since it's a free summon from the hand and can dump an Intruder, a card that can be summoned back out from the graveyard later. Angle's flip effect can summon a TheDuelLogs monster from the deck, and while in the graveyard, TheDuelLogs Dueltaining is even a soul charge for 3 TheDuelLogs at once so long as you have no monsters in the extra monster zone. But the issue with these effects is that they all summon in face-down defense position because most of the TheDuelLogs monsters happen to be flip monsters. And while monsters are face down, even if you and your opponent know exactly what they are, they don't have names, so for monsters to summon Wicked Circuit's Floodgate, you would need a way of flipping all of your monsters face up, as otherwise it's not really doing anything. What makes this even worse is that even within its own archetype, this first effect is redundant. If you have a way of flipping up cards, you can flip up Angle during the battle phase, not only summon a flip monster from deck, but also to end the battle phase before you're ever attacked. Meanwhile, if you have even just a single TheDuelLogs set on the field with Naggle's protection up, your opponent isn't going to be able to beat over your board anyways, as it protects all your TheDuelLogs from being destroyed by battle. So the only really unique effect of Euler's is its ability to give your opponent a monster. And while this could end up resulting in an OTK, too much has to go right for it to work, because you need to activate Euler's on your turn first so that you can use its effect during your standby phase on turn 3. So before then, you have to get a TheDuelLogs face up on the field and pray that it survives until then, especially because most of the TheDuelLogs cards don't really put up any kind of meaningful interaction that would actually stop an opponent from building up their board, or removing your cards from the field if they fail to push for lethal. And even if all that happens, you have to jump through the hoops of making a cute Cerberus and have base guard down the graveyard while hoping that your opponent can't remove their new TheDuelLogs from the field if you want any chance at OTKing. Euler's Circuit is an oddity of a card. Its first effect is both redundant and non-synergistic, while its second effect is used to enable an incredibly slow and precarious OTK that can only ever work when going first. Even in TheDuelLogs itself, most pilots are going to forgo ever using it, because trying to set up and pull off its effect is so awkward that's an active detriment to the strategy to go for. Bound in number 3, we have Soulbinding Gate, another awkward to use oddity whose conditions are even more specific. Soulbinding Gate's actual effect is pretty interesting, because if either player summons a single monster during the main phase with an attack that is less than or equal to your life points, you must destroy that monster, then take 100 damage, then your opponent takes 100 damage too. But to activate this effect, you need to have Z1 in your graveyard. And to even place Soul Binding Gate onto the field, not only do you need to control no monsters, but a set spell or trap card you control needed to have been destroyed by a card effect on the same turn. And for such demanding activation requirements, you would hope that Binding Gate's effect would be game-winningly strong, or at the very least would put you at a huge advantage. But at best, it's only really just okay. If you somehow manage to successfully commit to a gate, it's actually a pretty decent floodgate, because while it prevents you from building any kind of board, it does the same for your opponent and can even enable a stun or burn strategy to gradually whittle away your opponent's life points while making it difficult for them to actually put any monsters on field. But you still have to be vigilant, since your life points are on the clock too, meaning that if your opponent does land a monster on their field, either through removing gate or getting rid of Z1 from the grave, or just gradually whittle away your life points so they can summon a monster, they're likely just going to end the game on the spot almost immediately. And this effect is pretty mediocre as a result, because even though it can sometimes be a fine floodgate, you're not even guaranteed to win a game as a result of activating it, which is made even worse by Gate's awkward and unintuitive requirements. In order to even attempt to use Gate, you need essentially 3 cards worth of investment. A way to get Gate, a spare spell or trap that you don't mind getting rid of, and a way to pop one of your own back row. But that's just to get Gate onto the field. If you want to actually take advantage of the card, you're going to want to destroy, or at least get to the grave, 1 Z1, a near useless normal spell that actually has no activatable on-field effect, which limits its use pretty much as grabbing it out of Soulbinding Gate that's found its way to the grave when you destroy it. But despite how terrible a card Z1 is, if you're playing Gate, it's basically mandatory to run in some capacity, since without it in the graveyard, Gate literally has no effect. And what's worse is that the opposite is also true. You never want to draw into Z1 unless you have a way to access Gate, or at least put it into your graveyard, as otherwise it's not going to do anything. And without a way to pop your own cards, even if you happen to get both, you've basically drawn 2 bricks instead of 1, as now your combo isn't going to be able to function. Soulbinding Gate is one of the most unfortunate cards on this list. Compared to other terrible field spells features, its effect is actually decently strong, but because its conditions are so harsh, it's near unusable. Even though other field spells might have worse effects, there's at least a chance that you can take advantage of your opponent not being able to attack, or that Xyz Override's cost replacement might come up. But Gate is not only difficult to use, it forces you to play some terrible cards that, if drawn on their own, are going to be stuck in your hand as do-nothing bricks, actively making most of your hands and your deck as a whole worse as a result. And pulling into number 2 is Don't Slip, the Dogs of War. Another field spell that can draw you 2 cards that actually has an easier requirement compared to Dueltaining. Because if you have Don't Slip on the field and you draw a tuner for draw for turn, if you reveal the tuner, you get to draw 2 more cards for free. However, your opponent also gets the same opportunity, allowing them to do the same thing and more if they draw a tuner, because not only do they get a chance to draw 2 cards, you lose 2,000 life points, and then you're forced to send Don't Slip to the graveyard. Now, Don't Slip is supposed to represent the really intense game of tug of war, but the reward doesn't quite match the risk. You see, if you activate Don't Slip on your first turn, your opponent is the one that has the initiative to use its effect, as your first chance to draw off with Don't Slip is always going to be on your second turn, while your opponent has a chance to use it during their draw phase when you pass to them. And if they do happen to draw, then Don't Slip is going to burn you and send itself to the graveyard, not just making it a useless card to activate, but one that solely benefited your opponent. Now, it definitely isn't guaranteed that your opponent is going to draw from Don't Slip, but it's not unlikely either, especially in the modern era. In fact, you might have ended up turning a bad draw into a really good one, because a lot of the game's best hand traps happen to be tuners, and usually drawing them as your 6th card when going second is pretty unfortunate, as it's going to be a bit too late to use it to prevent your opponent from building up a board. But if you have Don't Slip on the field, that mediocre draw suddenly becomes an amazing one for your opponent, as you basically turned a hand trap into a better pot of greed for them. However, your opponent isn't always going to draw from Don't Slip. In fact, you can even circumvent the risk entirely by using Metaverse or Demise of the Land to activate Don't Slip from your deck during your opponent's turn, so you'll be the first player with the opportunity to draw with it. But you have to ensure that you can get to the next turn to make this happen, since card advantage is a lot less appealing if your opponent can get 8,000 damage on board. And even if somehow everything goes right, if your opponent didn't draw from Don't Slip and it goes back to your turn, you still have to get lucky. You're not guaranteed to draw a tuner either, and all the effort and luck that you put into surviving might have all been for nothing, when you could have instead activated something to immediately get advantage from your turn, like Pot of Desires, or even a Cup of Ace, just as long as you're subscribed to Luke Von Karma. Don't Slip is a terrible card, so much its name serves as its own warning label, because by activating it, you're likely to be giving ground to your opponent in some way or another. And while the card might have some extremely fringe cases where it could be usable, you're not even guaranteed to gain any advantage from it, making all that potential risk that comes from playing the card and trying to get your turn 3 all for nothing. But even with that in mind, there's still one more card that's even worse than Don't Slip. And while Don't Slip can end up being a benefit, the next card on this list is irredeemably bad. At this time of year, at this time of day, in this part of the video, localized entirely with the number 1, is the Nordic Lights, the worst field spell card in the game. Nordic Spells has two pretty simple effects, with one being an upside that prevents any Nordic monster from being destroyed by battle while it's on the field. But the second one is a downside that makes it so that if Nordic Lights is ever destroyed by a card effect, you have to destroy all of your Nordic monsters. Even if you don't know anything about Nordics, it's pretty easy to tell how bad the effect is at first glance, as while protecting your archetypal monster from battle can often be somewhat useful, Nordic Lights existing essentially puts a glowing weak point on your field that's telling the opponent to destroy it when they want to wipe away your Nordic monsters. However, this is made even worse when you take into account that the Nordic beasts actually want your monsters to be able to destroy by battle if you want to get most of them, namely the goats Tongrister of the Nordic beasts, which can summon 2 tokens when destroyed by battle, or Tongjoster of the Nordic beasts, which can special summon itself when another monster you control is destroyed by battle. However, Nordic, as a strategy, has managed to evolve past relying on battle destruction to get their play started. And they're actually decently competent at summoning out their Azure synchro monsters thanks to the deck's more modern support, but especially due to Gullveig, which can summon up to 3 Nordic monsters from your deck at once, giving you more than enough materials for a synchro summon. And thankfully, none of the Azure monsters are actually Nordic monsters themselves, which means that neither of the effects of Nordic Lights impact them at all, so they won't be destroyed if it leaves the field, and their attacks are high enough to the point where you don't really need to worry about being destroyed by battle. In fact, the only Nordic monster that's likely going to be left on the field is Gullveig, who has an effect that protects an Azure monster it's pointing to from being targeted with any kind of card effect. But Gullveig themselves has pitiful attack stats, so it might even seem like Nordic Lights might have some utility protected from just being beaten over by your opponent so they can target your Azures again. However, the same effect that protects monsters Gullveig is pointing to also happens to prevent her from being targeted for an attack, which means that if you add Nordic Lights into your board, you're actively making it weaker by giving your opponent an easy way to deal with Gullveig without the battle phase with just a single MST, Nightmare Phoenix, or Harpy's Feather Duster, thereby weakening your Azure end board by opening it up to being targeted. No matter what sort of context you look at the Nordic Lights in, whether in the older or modern game, it's a card that's only ever going to hinder your game plan by putting an unnecessarily weak spot onto your board for a benefit that's been redundant and counterintuitive since the deck was released. Its irrelevant upside could never be worth the cost of such a strangely devastating downside. It makes it so there's almost never going to be a game state where it's worth activating, putting amongst some of the worst cards in the game, not just the worst field spells. Alright, and that's the list. If you think there's any field spells we've missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments below.